I love history. I love historical texts and primary documents from the past, but texts are written by humans, and humans can make mistakes. Humans can lie, but your garbage doesn't lie. What you leave behind, the material culture you leave behind, can tell all sorts of stories about you. If I was able to go through your trash can, I could tell you all about what you were doing last week.
I was contacted by a man named Roy Carter, whose father and mother owned the house right before Project Pride bought the house. And he told me that there was a pit out back that they had filled with junk from the house. One of the things was the shingle that was on the house when the Howards lived here. It said Dr. Howard Residence. Didn't know what it was, threw it into the pit. And it's, of course, that would be an incredible Howard artifact to find. My immediate response was, well, let me see, who would be interested in a junk-filled pit at the Howard house? I thought of Jeff Shanks, of course, and well, the rest is history.
We have accounts from Project Pride, when they purchased the house, that it was still somewhat open. So I'm guessing if they filled it in, it settled and sunk in more. What we're doing now, we've been going through that fill for the last couple of days.
I found some of the different kinds of glass and quite a few bent nails.
And let me tell you, it has not been fun.
I like that piece of green glass.
It's been slow going, but we're getting there.
So what's really exciting about this project, Jerome?
I think just the idea that a professional archaeology team from a national organization like the National Park Service is coming across Plains America to do an official dig on a site that's got real potential. I just think the excitement of seeing how it happens. Here comes your way.
This is a total station, and I am setting it up so that we can map in spatially where everything is located, which is a bit of a process. Got it? Okay. Now to the southwest, you set up a transit, you create an artificial plane that has to be kept at a level position. And from that, this transit will shoot out a laser that will capture in a crystal and bounce back to this machine. And the machine will actually calculate the distance of where everything is located, but not just the distance, but also how high up and down objects are. So that way we can possibly see any other human modifications to the soil and ground. Spatial distance is one of the things that's key for us to understanding how people interact with their environment and how they establish different areas for different functions. And so that's why we're always interested in the spatial data.
Maybe he'll come down tomorrow. I'll message him.
So did you know anything of Howard before Jeff roped you into this?
Not really. I've heard of Conan the Barbarian, but that's as far as it went. Didn't know who created him. Didn't know how far it went.
I noticed you were reading some of the Western stories.
I was, yeah. So far, what have I read? I read The Tower of the Elephant, which I enjoyed, and then we listened to Red Nails on the way over here.
Ah.
And so, trying to find other stories to get into, and I wanted to read some of the Westerns. So Jeff recommended that. So far, I think I like the Westerns more.
Why is that?
I like the historic. As an archaeologist, I'm more of a historical fantasy person.
Mm-hmm.
But historical fiction's my realm of reading that I enjoy. So, big fan of George R.R. Martin.
Yeah.
And then learning that George R.R. Martin was influenced by Robert E. Howard really made me excited. So I'm like, wow, now I kind of want to get into what influenced Martin more. So.
I've always known that he wrote it, but when my grandfather and my dad were alive, it wasn't really that big of a deal until Patrice and them started, messing around with it. And by that time, my grandfather was already dead, and it wasn't shortly after that my dad died. So, there's a million questions I could have asked if I'd have known, or we'd have been that deep into it. We just thought, this guy wrote this book, and he's kin to us.
Have you enjoyed kind of catching up, I guess, on on learning about him
Oh,
and
it's
that sort of thing?
unbelievable. He's known about it all his life. Ever since he was old enough to understand, he's known that, you know, this was part of our family where this came from.
At first, yeah, it was, hey, I'm related to him and let's read a bunch of his stuff. But then, yeah, I grew attached and wanted to know, and, you know, obviously his tragic story, and just kind of grew into, yeah, wanting to know more about my kin, and, you know, he wrote these things and what was going on in his life, and, you know, how those things tied into his stories and the reasonings.
Did you get into boxing before you knew that he was such an avid boxer?
Yeah, 10, 12, 13 is about when I started really getting into Robert E. Howard and Conan, and I'd always been boxing. Boxing and martial arts was always a big part. I've had swords my whole life. I'm the kind of kid that took my kids or my friends to the backyard and let's go sword fight. So I mean, it's funny that, you know, it's the exact same person in a lot of ways. Yeah.
My father was Golden Glove boxer in Waco.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when he was young.
He was also a Robert Howard.
Well, he was actually named after Robert.
Oh, really?
His name was Robert Lee, but he was named after Robert E.
We started seeing cavities starting to open up underneath the fill dirt that had been put inside here, and we realized that it was a jar. And as we started opening up, we found more jars next to it. And so now what we see here is the top of a row of jars that's probably resting on a shelf down below. Go ahead and take this off.
Yeah!
Great one.
Often a very rare thing to find something like this. Given the amount of fill dirt and rocks and things that were thrown in here, it's really amazing that we actually have this kind of preservation and have jars actually stacked on top of each other still in place after at least 5 or 6 decades probably.
Green beans.
So you can see the reason they're all open is because they had metal lids which have rusted away, leaving the glass behind it. Although on this one and probably some of the others, what does survive is the rubber gasket that was inside the metal lid that would have made the seal on these jars. So the metal rusts away, but it leaves the rubber behind.
Go ahead and take this out, and then we'll put the additional information on there. So this is the first jar that we took out of the excavation unit, and it has a metal top to it, which has decomposed and sunk in, so there's a lot of dirt material in here, and it's rotted away. We also recovered part of the rubber gasket that was in here as well. This has a clear space on it all the way around, so there's no molded letters or information, but what it does have down here at the bottom is actually what's called an orange peel texturing to it down across the bottom. All right, and then so the type of lid that's on the top is an indicator of its age. It's a later, this is a metal as opposed to a zinc lid, and it's a screw on as opposed to a crank snap down lid. So once glass companies started using molds to make their glass, they started including information on those molds that would give us an idea about the age that we use now to age these. And so using this mold that has this orange peel texturing down here at the bottom is also one indicator as well of how the enclosure, the neck, and the threading is done around the top. That's another indicator of age. And then when you come down here at the bottom, this is where we get the most information. This is a maker's mark. I'm going to turn it around so you can see it better. It's got an H, and inside that H is an A. And that stands for the Hazel Atlas company, and they made a lot of glass jars and bottles. And then there's a couple other numbers around here as well. So these numbers give us an idea of the plant, and then the type of mold. This is mold number 12. And then over here was the letter for A, which was, what was that again? The Ada, Oklahoma, too. So from that we get a lot of information, but this orange peel texture in the rim also kind of narrowed it down quite a bit for us.
and that it was from the World War II era, and which canning and preserving your own fruits and vegetables became very important because of the war efforts and depression. There was a depression era, so going out and buying canned goods was more difficult, and so a lot of people were growing their own small gardens and then canning and preserving their own foods, so that way they could make their food last farther and that they wouldn't need additional resources that had to be purchased. We will take a look at the contents. Right now it's pretty muddy in there, and we'll try and figure out what exactly the contents are inside this jar as well. Most likely the contents have completely decomposed, but we're hoping that there might be some seeds that might give us an idea of what it was. But this dates from the World War II era, so unfortunately it dates to after the Howard family.
We are finding a number of smaller items, some of which probably date from the period that the Howards were here. One of the more interesting ones is a glass pipette, which is a small glass tube that was usually used for medical reasons or apothecary uses, that sort of thing. And so that may be something that's related to Robert E. Howard's father, Isaac, who was a country doctor. One of the really interesting finds we had was a couple of metal rivets that had the name Providence, Rhode Island written on them, which is, of course, the home of Howard's correspondent and fellow pulp writer, H.P. Lovecraft. And, of course, they corresponded and they did send things to each other. It'd be nice to think that that came from something that Lovecraft may have sent to Howard. Probably not, but it's a fun coincidence nonetheless.
What are you hoping that this dig kind of does for the town of Cross Plains? You know, draw more attention, or?
Well, we had hoped it would stir up a lot of interest in the history of their area right here, because it would be digging up some stuff that probably is relevant and it's probably on some of their own backyards. So we would hope that it would get them interested in a deeper history of their town. Deeper in several ways.
It's exciting as all get out because it's kind of akin to finding an old photograph of Howard that we did not know existed, and what treasures we might unearth. That's where the real excitement is.
Archaeology can tell the stories about people's daily lives that you don't get from the history texts. It can tell the stories that otherwise wouldn't get told. Hopefully we'll be able to tell some stories about Howard the man, not just Howard the famous writer and all of the legends and mythology that's built up around that. It's nice to be able to get to the real Howard, Howard the human being, you know, who lived and breathed and died right here.